Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Pat Zerke, Director of the Forum. For 36 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. American teachers, policymakers, taxpayers, and parents are looking for answers. School reform has been discussed and attempted many times over the last 20 years, but we are still not certain that our public schools are really preparing our children for life as citizens, workers, and responsible adults in the 21st century. Our society needs to renegotiate the social contract with our public schools. This final program on schools and society focuses on reinventing public education, examining the mission, governance, structure, and funding of a transformed school system. What would such a transformed system look like? What would it take to make it a reality? Here to discuss these questions is Jay Kaufman, Massachusetts State Representative and Director of the Project on a New Public Education at Brandeis University. This 18-month project examined the underlying assumptions about our education system in an effort to understand and begin to address the crisis of confidence in public education. Formerly an educator and executive director of the Massachusetts Bay Consortium, a nonprofit association of 18 colleges and universities, Kaufman holds a BA in philosophy and an MA in comparative history from Brandeis, and a second master's degree in history from New York University. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Jay Kaufman.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Pat, and also to you, Jamie, for this series that has been extremely informative. I'm not up to the challenge that Pat has just given me to define a new public education for you, but I would invite you this evening to join with me in a creative journey. I'm hoping that you will engage with me in taking a look at some of the challenges that we face in the world of public education, and some of the very difficult choices that we have to make, and some of the very difficult and consequential decisions that lie ahead of us. My basic premise for this evening's conversation is that much of the contemporary debate about public education, about reforming public education, is about fine-tuning and fixing a system that is largely out of date and largely designed to address an age, an era whose time has passed. What I hope our discussion is about tonight is not reforming public education, but transforming public education. And to do that, we're going to need to suspend just about everything that we have experienced as students or teachers or administrators in our public school system, just about everything that we experience as taxpayers and as voters in our democracy, and think afresh, think anew about what a public education that is designed to address the circumstances of the 21st century might look like. And the basic premise, again, is that it would look quite different than the one that we know. I want to make it very clear from the outset that I am passionately committed to public education, and I don't want anybody to misinterpret anything that I say or any questions that I might raise to suggest that I have any doubts about today's students, today's teachers, today's administrators. That's not what this conversation is about. I think there are people who are doing remarkable work in the name of public education today. Many of the reformers, some of whom you've heard from in this series, are doing remarkable work at the cutting edge of our public education system. I'm just suggesting that we need a parallel conversation about a different public education system. And that's what I hope we will focus on tonight. Not an attack on public education, but a conversation about reinventing it and starting anew. What do I mean by a public education system whose time has passed? Fundamentally, the architecture of the system that we have dates back to the days of Horace Mann. Horace Mann was a member of the legislature in which I now serve in the early 19th century. As a member of that legislature, he proposed the first mandatory public education system the world had ever seen, and managed to get through the many hoops that it took to see that vision realized. So he created the notion of a public education system, or was largely responsible for its passage in the legislature at least, and then served as the Commonwealth's first Secretary of Education. So public education was invented in Massachusetts. Horace Mann is the DNA of public education system traces directly back to Horace Mann. But what do I mean about an architecture dated from his era? Let me just cite a couple of examples of what I mean by that. The school day and the school year that we know and have known since the early 19th century has much more to do with an agricultural community than with the communities in which we now find ourselves. Those of us who have adolescents know that while a 7:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. school day may work well for cows, it doesn't work real well for our kids. And there's some very sort of basic things about the way we structure our schools that, again, reflect an era whose time has passed, not a time to come. A couple of other quick examples. Most of our schools in this Commonwealth, as well as across the country, are organized along very neat disciplinary lines, not so much in the primary grades, but certainly beyond that. You take a math course, you take a history course, et cetera, et cetera. Most people in the world of higher education by now know that that's one way of structuring education system. It's not necessarily the only way of doing it, and it's certainly worth a debate about whether it's the best way to offer public education for students in their formative years. The teachers operate pretty much in isolation in any school system that we know. Occasional opportunities for collegiality in some of the more progressive schools, there is actually decent opportunity for that. But for the most part, teaching is a pretty lonely profession. And everything that we've learned about organizations over the last couple of generations should tell us instantly that that's a formula for less than ideal circumstances. The conversations that we have about assessment and testing tell us that most of what we're thinking about right now in terms of measuring outcomes is still focusing on what we've learned, not how we've learned or that we can learn. So we're still forget about whether MCAS are good or bad for the moment. We're still teaching in a model that just doesn't seem to be a correct model if we're looking ahead. School buildings. If you travel across this country, you will recognize a school building in every town, in every state. They all are virtually the same. Is that a good idea? I would suggest that at least it's worth a conversation about whether that tells us something and whether thinking about school architecture, it's just the physical building, never mind school system architecture, just the building, whether that's not a conversation worth engaging in. One of my favorite anachronisms is the way we finance our public school systems. We are heavily dependent on local property taxes to fund schools. Now, when Horace Mann first suggested that as a viable way of paying for public schools, the students in these public schools, the students to be served by these public schools, were the sons, the white sons, of landowners. So attaching a public school system to a property tax when the citizens that you were trying to train were only white males may have made some sense. I don't think there's anybody advocating that that is the school system that we have today or want today for today or tomorrow. So we need to go back to basics. It worked at one point. Does it work today? No. We need to think creatively about what's going to replace it or complement it as we move forward. Last point. Most of the way school systems are organized and governed, and most of the way individual school buildings are organized and governed, bears a very close relationship to a traditional top-down model. Again, we're in the 21st century now. There's not a business that's successful anymore that operates in that way, or that will be successful for very long if it's still operating that way. We've learned a lot about organizational change, organizational learning. Very little of that is reflected in the way the public sector is run, quite frankly, and that holds true of government as a whole. It holds true in particular of the education establishment. The education establishment is among the more traditional establishments in this country. We are teaching the way we were taught, and I've heard it likened to getting into a car, turning on the engine, and getting ready to drive and putting your hands firmly on the rearview mirror. Doesn't work. What are the sort of dynamics, what are the features, what is the architecture that we might want to be thinking about for a new public education? First of all, we have to embrace institutionally as well as intellectually the fact that we have an explosion of knowledge now, and that what we learn today pales by comparison to what we're going to have to learn tomorrow and next week. The rate at which information is coming to us and the rate at which information is available to us suggests that it's not as important that we learn specific details and specific facts, although I don't want to discount that for a second, but we need to be prepared to keep learning for an entire lifetime. One of the characteristics of the marketplace is that anyone coming through schools now will not just change jobs many times in the course of his or her lifetime, but will likely change careers an average of 7 times. Those are the statistics. Where they come from, I don't know. But if I look at my life, I'm on number 4 right now. And I think our kids and grandchildren are not going to start a career and end up in the same corporation, retired at age 65 with a golden watch. That's not the world that they were born into. So we're talking about lifelong learning. And if you develop a school system around ages 3, if you're generous, 6 for the most part, and 18, that's lifelong learning only if you're 18. By the time you get to be 19, it's no longer lifelong learning. And the model that is built into our educational systems doesn't embrace the notion of perpetual learning, perpetual growth. We also don't embrace, in the way we teach or the way we learn, the way we measure success, teaming. We're measured as individual students or as individual teachers, not in the way we interact with one another for collective learning or collective teaching, but we're measured individually. And again, that's historically interesting, but anachronistic for our day and age. Not very far from where we are sitting or standing right now, Howard Gardner gave us the notion of multiple intelligences. We know intuitively, and we know from his work and many who have succeeded him, that we learn and teach in very different ways. You can't necessarily tell that in the way we structure our public education system. It's not quite one size fits all, and certainly if you're in some of the more exciting school systems, there are some variations on a theme. But we do need to ask, what would a school system, what would the architecture of a school system be that really embraced the notion that there are radically different ways that we exchange information, that we absorb information, that we compact information, and that we learn to do something with that information. Lastly, I'll mention the fact that in our grandparents' day, and certainly in Horace Mann's day, it might have been appropriate to define the universe of learning as that which occurred in a school building and maybe in a church, and occasionally, if you're talking about moral education, at home. None of us looking at the way people learn today would define it in that way. There are all sorts of other ways. Most of the kids whose parents can afford it have after-school enrichment programs and summer enrichment programs and internships and externships. There's the net, there's TV, there's all the cultural opportunities that are available. We need to think of that as a part of what we mean by teaching and learning, not as the add-on, not as the extra, not as something that is irrelevant to our public education system. Let me go back to Horace Mann for just a second. We're about to celebrate the 207th anniversary of his birthday on May 4th. And in addition to being a politician, and I use the term advisedly and carefully and respectfully, he was a visionary and a statesman, and articulated for us a vision that I think was revolutionary in his day and is every bit as powerful today. He had basically 3 goals for our public education system. And again, don't forget, he was inventing this from nothing. But his goals were an informed and engaged citizenry, individuals empowered to provide for themselves and their families and their community, part of the economic vitality of this country, of this Commonwealth and this country. And lastly, he had a notion that most people who understand Horace Mann seem to have, we know about it as a historical artifact, it's lost its power, but I want to return its luster to it. Let me quote a line from a speech he gave in 1848. "Education beyond all other devices of human origin is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the sexism notwithstanding. the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. So let me repeat that. The balance wheel of the social machinery. The spread of education by enlarging the cultivated class or caste will open a wider area over which the social feelings will expand. And if this education be universal and complete, it would do more than all things else to obliterate facetious distinctions in society. The balance wheel of society. Horace Mann in his day, as we in ours, we see enormous inequities. Inequities along racial lines, along economic lines, along lines of opportunity. And he saw that reality was fundamentally corrosive to the society he envisioned. So fundamentally corrosive to democracy and to any kind of vital economy. He was right in 1848. It's right in 2003. And we've got a long way to go to realize his vision of a great balance wheel. Take quick stock of where we are in terms of the goals that he set for public education. It's very hard to say that we're doing a good job of civics education when only about half of us who are registered to vote bother to vote, and when many people don't even bother to register to vote, and even those who are registered and vote know relatively little about the way we organize ourselves as a society, and certainly don't feel empowered to change that society in any way. I can tell you from firsthand experience, if I get 2 phone calls on a particular topic, it's virtually a landslide. I just don't hear from people. We need to do a better job of making sure we have an engaged and informed citizenry before Horace Mann's vision is realized. So we've got a long way to go on that score. In terms of providing graduates who are able to take jobs, hold jobs, and grow in their jobs, the impetus for the 1993 Education Reform Act, the last great wave of reform in Massachusetts, came from an organization called the Mass Business Alliance for Educators. Didn't come from Beacon Hill, came from the business community because many of their workers were untrained and untrainable. So we are not realizing Horace Mann's vision of a school system that is going to provide for a vital economy. And lastly, I don't need to tell this audience about how far we have to go with regard to equity and the gross inequities that we experience now. If anything, our recent history should give us enormous pause because the gap between the rich and poor in this country has never been greater, and it is growing at an ever-increasing rate, an alarmingly increasing rate, and the same holds true for disparities of race. Our schools today are more segregated than they were a decade ago. We made enormous progress for a while, and now we are in reverse. We have beat a retreat over the last couple of years. You are more likely to be in a single-race classroom today as a student than you were a decade ago. So Horace Mann's dream is alive and well, and the system that we have to invent to realize that dream has yet to be defined. And that's the work that we are about here this evening. And I'll have to disappoint Pat in that I don't have the answer to the question of what Horace Mann would invent today, but I do have some suggestions as to where we need to look to begin to answer that question. Let's start with a couple of the big design elements. First of all, I envision, when I think about public education, I don't think about a school. I think about something, because the term is defined with red bricks and certain very clear dimensions. I think we need to be thinking about a learning commons, a place where everybody in a community can come to learn and can come to teach. I'm imagining a learning commons that includes a school building, might include a senior center, might include a job training facility, so that everyone who is engaged on that commons is in the process of exploring, in the process of growth, and in the process of exchanging the excitement that comes from that with one another. And this holds true for people in first grade. It holds true for people who are going through their third career change in their 50s. So a learning commons, which is crosses age, knows no time limits in terms of time of day, and certainly knows no seasonal limits, and is a a center for learning and a center for teaching that speaks to the entire community, not just those between certain ages. In terms of the governance of this kind of learning commons, right now, again, we have a very tops-down kind of approach to governance. I have filed a bill that takes a lot from the experience of the project I was involved in at Brandeis and eliminates the current Board of Education, just strikes it from the books and starts again. Let's hold the State Board of Education. Thank you for that clarification. And strikes it from the books and creates a new board with a very different composition and ultimately, although this isn't in the legislation right now, with a very different mission. I see a Board of Education as something akin to an accreditation authority, an organization that would ask questions of those of us proposing to establish any kind of education center, any kind of learning commons. And those questions would include, how are you going to serve the public interest? Do you guarantee us that you're not discriminating, that you're not affiliated with any denomination, that this is really a public institution serving a public end and worthy of receiving public funds? What is your pedagogical approach? How are you going to manage yourselves? How are you going to finance yourself? What is your budget going to look like? What are the areas that you're going to focus on in terms of budgetary priorities? How are you going to hold everybody in the system accountable? How are you going to measure success and failure, and what are you going to do about it? Both success and failure. What is the curriculum going to look like? How are you going to make sure that people coming through your system aren't just prepared for the next chapter of their lives, but are empowered for lifelong learning? How are you going to make sure you get the basics that we all agree that we need? Some numeracy, some literacy, some understanding of our civic responsibility. How are you yourself going to model the kind of learning community, learning commons, learning organization that will not just teach verbally, but teach by example? And then the proposals to this accreditation authority, accreditation agency, would come with a set of 5-year goals. 5 years, could be 6 years, could be 4 years, but a set of goals, finite goals reachable within a finite period of time. And at the end of that period of time, this accreditation agency would then measure what has happened with that institution that has been accredited. Has it met its goals? Has it failed in important ways that it has learned from? What are its goals for the next 5 years? And this would be a process of constantly renewing your license to be a school, as opposed to the kind of systems that we have right now, where we have essentially government monopoly of schools, and they just exist ad infinitum. There's no point at which it is important for the system itself, the school itself, or for the system as a whole to stop and take stock and make some mid-course corrections. I think that needs to change. So that's what an accreditation model would allow us to do. There are details I could fill in, and I think I'll do that with you in a Q&A format if you want to pursue specific questions about how that model would operate. But let me mention a few more highlights of this new public education. The fact that you are setting up an accreditation agency not only allows for perpetual learning of a school and a school system, it also allows for some diversity of experience. Not everybody proposing to this accreditation agency will propose the same model. In fact, you are inviting and encouraging very different approaches to teaching and learning. And that is, I think, as it should be. Since there are different ways that we teach and learn, why should we have just one model for what a school looks like? It has as a corollary the empowerment of the community that comes together around the proposal and around the reaccreditation process. So those involved, teachers, family members of students, the students themselves, the community, the taxpayers, would need to come together to design a school and make sure that it's doing what it's set out to do. So it professionalizes the process of public education in a way that right now is a little hard to find. This would allow individual schools to get on the map. It could also allow systems of schools. There's no reason why Cambridge as a community couldn't decide that they want a system of schools that are the Cambridge public schools. And then a body would come together, make a proposal for a Cambridge school system. That would be evaluated, and if it met the test, would be accredited, and would then operate perhaps very much like the Cambridge school system does today. But it could also apply to a system of schools that have a common pedagogical approach. The Montessori schools, for example, the Coalition of Essential Schools, organizations that have a common pedagogy could get accreditation for a system of schools that then had chapters, if you will, in Cambridge, in Lexington, in Winchester, in Springfield, across the Commonwealth. So you could have different school systems organized by geography as we now know it, and systems organized along pedagogical lines, but that would be public schools. The corollary to having all these different kinds of approaches to teaching and learning is that we as parents are empowered to make some choices for ourselves and for our kids about where they would best be served. And if you have some choice of different approaches, you also need to be able to make an informed choice. So part of the responsibility, if we're able to take this public education system that I'm imagining and begin to realize it, one of the responsibilities would be to make sure that we address how parents and families are going to have the information they need to make responsible decisions about where their children might go, how best they will be served. We also need to think about how we fund our schools. I mentioned at the top that our reliance on property taxes doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work in large part because it guarantees a balkanized approach to public education. It guarantees that if a community has a great deal of property wealth, there will be a great deal of money to spend on the schools. And absent that property wealth, there will not be the resources for a public school system. And there's no subtlety, no matter how you measure success, there is no subtlety to the fact that if you are a student in a community that has a great deal of property wealth, much more money is being spent on your education, and the odds are that you will be getting better results than if you live in a poorer community. We cannot afford as a commonwealth or as a nation anymore to allow that to exist. We need to find other forms of funding to complement the resources that we get from local property taxes and make sure that students are adequately provided for. There's a quantum leap that we still need to take in terms of the public debate about that, because the 1993 Education Reform Act was all about equalizing funding so that students in poor communities were going to be, their school budgets were going to be buttressed by state funds so that there wouldn't be the enormous disparity between wealthy communities and poor communities. And there is a great success story to be told because we have come a long way in the last decade. Those gross inequities no longer exist. What still exists, however, are gross inequities of opportunity. Because one of the realizations that has come with equalizing funding is that there's a distinction between equalizing funding and equalizing opportunity. And a student growing up without English in the home, without a computer in the home, without a decent breakfast before coming to school, without summer camps to go to, and without trips to Europe and the Far East to enjoy, that student has a very different road to opportunity than the students who are growing up with greater privilege. And we need to be thinking about that as a society and about addressing some of the inequities that are inherent in the way students come to school, but not in their qualities as individuals. Let me say a couple of things about it's very easy to take a look at this model and first of all be a little bit overwhelmed by how different it is and have a hard time sort of grasping what this would look like. And I fully appreciate how difficult the task is that I'm asking you to engage in with me tonight. If it's any comfort, the project I directed at Brandeis had as its associate director Ted Sizer, who is not new to big thinking about education. He and I had to discipline ourselves for about the first 6 months to not engage in conversations about MCAS exams. We fell into the old challenges and the current challenges and had a very hard time breaking away from that and thinking about a system that we really couldn't define yet, that we were trying to define. So bear with the uncertainty of this conversation, if you will and if you can. I also don't want anybody to misinterpret a call for greater diversity in the way we teach and learn for anything short of holding students and teachers and school systems accountable. I think we do need to hold ourselves and our schools and our kids and our teachers accountable for performance. But I would suggest that if you have a diversity of approaches to teaching and learning, you also need to have a diversity of measurements of success and failure. And I think we need to be much more creative than we've been so far in the debate about assessment. Let me skip, in the interest of making sure there's time for an exchange amongst us, let me skip some of the other details that I was hoping to introduce and see how they come up in the Q&A session, and just add on a note of both caution and optimism. The history of education reform in this country, and for that matter, the history of most reforms in the public sector in this country, teaches us that major transformations are few and far between. For the most part, what we do, in the public sector in particular, is tinkering and fixing problems at the edges. On a good day, my colleagues and I in the legislature right now adopt best practices that are already in the field. We rarely shed light and invent something that is not yet in the books or on the books. Horace Mann did. That was an exception, not absolutely unique, but it was rare in the annals of public education debate, indeed in public policy debate. So the kind of transformation that we're talking about is not the norm, and it's not the work of one legislature or a couple of years. It's the work of a generation or two, and it will take a great deal. We're talking about crossing a huge divide from where we are to where I think we need to be. And David Ben-Gurion said it as well as anybody that I've known when he said, you cannot cross a chasm in small steps. The kind of education reform debate we're having is important, and we need to have a debate about the big steps that we haven't yet really framed. And I take some comfort from Thoreau, who speaks not only to the challenge that we have before us, but I think to me in some very important ways, and I think to all of us in terms of the opportunities that we have. He says, if you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put foundations under them. So that's the work that we have ahead of us. I welcome not just your questions, but your thoughts. I have a great deal of confidence that the question that has been put before us, that is, what would Horace Mann invent today? I have a great deal of confidence that that's the right question. I think we're just beginning the hunt for answers, and I look forward to your participation in that hunt. So. Thank you.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Jay Kaufman discussing Reinventing Public Education. Jay, I'm going to ask you the first question. And you talked about big steps. Well, this strikes me as a big step. We have a long tradition of local control, especially in states like Massachusetts, where it's a very old tradition and a very strong tradition in school finance and in governance. How does this tradition affect chances for new state, new federal standards, for the new kind of educational system that you are thinking of?
Very good question, and an enormously difficult challenge. Most of what we have seen over the last couple of years points in the opposite direction that I would like to be pointing in. We are right now just coming to terms with the new federal legislation dealing with, it's called No Child Left Behind. The best thing about that legislation is its title. But it certainly doesn't address the challenge that you've laid out for us in terms of local control. Indeed, if anything, it substitutes federal control for local control. Similarly, the 1993 Education Reform Act, again, a breakthrough piece of legislation here in Massachusetts, had some internal tensions. The 93 Education Reform Act created the MCAS exams and created the curriculum frameworks, which, although they needn't do so, there's no absolute necessity that they lead to standardization. They have a tendency to lead to standardization and move away from any kind of creative and diverse approach to public education. On the other hand, the 93 Education Reform Act had charter schools, which were designed to be schools to break the mold. And in some ways, the charter school provisions of the 1993 Education Reform Act are the perfect underpinning for what I'm thinking about as an accreditation model. Every school should be a charter school, in that there should be a requirement that there be some creative work that goes on to invent, sustain, and then reinvent an educational institution. To your point, we have a very strong tradition of locally controlled schools. I recognize that it has some serious advantages, not the least of which is the community building that goes on. When my kids are in school with their neighbors, their social community at school and out of school is the same. That brings a series of families together, neighboring families together. There's some very significant community building advantages to that kind of approach. And both because of the strengths and because of the strength of the tradition, I think any new public education would have to allow for a continuation of that model, local control. And I think we also need to have some complementary models for those families that would not necessarily be served by their local school, and for those teachers that would like to do something a little bit different. So it's not a particularly satisfying answer, because I don't think we can get rid of our tradition of local control. And as I say, there are some merits to it. We just need to figure out how to work with it.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Jay Kaufman discussing Reinventing Public Education. The floor is now open for your questions, comments. And I think we might have a lot of questions, so I'd ask you to be pointed and brief and succinct. And
you've already answered my first question, and my second one is you talked about interdisciplinary courses, and I did research at Harvard, and we're all for interdisciplinary research. But when I was in high school, you had a choice between taking history and English, or you could take a course that covered many things, and that, in my view, was pablum, whereas I was really learning things. How do you get really strong courses that are interdisciplinary when the teacher may be good at history and not know much about English or whatever?
Excellent question. You don't do it as pablum, and you almost certainly don't do it as a single teacher course. I've done a great deal of interdisciplinary teaching once on my own, and it was a disaster because I couldn't teach math and physics and history and literature equally well. Some of them I couldn't teach at all. And the course that I taught on my own became a course that 6 of us taught, and that was more appropriate. So I think that if we're serious about interdisciplinary education, we have to first of all be serious about maintaining the integrity of what we're teaching, both the component disciplines and the way they all fit together. We need to provide time for teachers who, for the most part, are trained in a discipline along the way to learn to talk to one another and to work with one another and create something that isn't just the sum of the parts, but is something greater than that. Because an interdisciplinary course, if well done, isn't just history and physics and chemistry. It's a conversation about what each of these disciplines has to teach us and how it all fits together. And that's not something that, I think the fact that you had such a course is fairly unusual. The fact that it was pablum is not terribly surprising given the era. Happily, at many universities now, there's some very excellent interdisciplinary education going on. So we've learned something about that. And we've got to be aware of the mistakes that we could make.
Yeah, I really liked your notion of a learning community with different ages being teachers and students and different community institutions being involved, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you know of any examples of those or programs that at least have some of those components.
No.
Yeah.
Quick answer to your question, but some of you out here might know of some examples, and I would certainly welcome that. It seems to me that the immediate challenge right now is to find people in all the various constituencies that need to be at the table who are willing to engage in this conversation. And so far, at least, your question about local control points to one institution that is inherently going to be protective of its turf. We have a member of the Lexington School Committee here today. Her every instinct, despite the fact that she is extraordinarily bright and as forward-thinking as anybody can be, her every instinct is going to be to do things the way the school committee has always done things and to protect the turf of the school committee. That's not necessarily what's going to happen at the end of the day, but that's going to be the instincts that certainly her colleagues have. Same holds true for the teachers' unions. They have been very slow to come to the table for this conversation. They were very slow to come to the table on charter schools and missed an enormous opportunity to have the charter school movement in Massachusetts be a way to invigorate public education, as opposed to what it turned out to be, which is an attack on public education. I think the way it was implemented was an attack on public education. It didn't need to be that way. So we need to figure out who all the people are who have to be at the table, including many people who are going to hate the questions that I'm raising. They need to be at the table even more than people who are excited by the questions.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the accreditation idea. And when you were first talking about it, my first question was, does this fit the charter school model? And one of the things, I think there are a lot of wonderful things about the charter school model, but geographically sometimes it can be challenging if charter schools end up being very specific or focused. Like you were saying, if they decide to pick a particular curriculum or approach, and that doesn't suit the people in that, all of the students in that community, then there becomes issues of transportation and, moving to other areas. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that some students will sort of be left out if there's a majority or if there's a large vocal community that wants one type of, new innovative school that doesn't necessarily fit the needs of all the students in the area? I don't know if you could talk about that.
It's a good question, and particularly troubling in smaller communities. Let me give some musings on your question rather than attempt answers to them, because I don't have clear answers. First of all, to the question of transportation. To some extent, it's likely to be the case that even after we've all shifted the ground and had a conversation with a different set of assumptions and a different framework, it's still likely to be the case that there will be some constraints on how far you can go. Although METCO students are now getting up at 5 in the morning to be at school in the suburban communities at 7:30. So the limits on how far we will go are limits that are self-imposed limits. So we need to continue a conversation about that. But addressing questions of transportation for students is an important question, but I wouldn't suggest we spend too much time on that right now, because right now there isn't even the commitment to go down the road of this transformed education system. Once we've made that commitment, that's one of the tougher nuts to crack. But we'll do that when we have a commitment to move in that direction. With regard to the kinds of choices that would be available, it seems to me that we're going to need to be inventive about making sure that there are such choices, and that we may need to create either professional development opportunities or financial incentives or perhaps some other mechanisms that are going to encourage diversity of educational opportunities within each of the communities. We may find that for whatever reason, I mean, I think Cambridge is likely to not have if Cambridge has a problem with different approaches, it will be that there are too many different approaches, not that there are too few. Other communities, there may be a problem of not enough inventiveness, or what we might deem to be not enough inventiveness. We may need to put some financial incentives in place or some other incentives in place to bring the kind of creativity and energy into that community to make sure that students in every community have some choice. And I think it's almost inevitable that we will never have equal opportunities across the Commonwealth. I mean, some of us live in small rural communities surrounded by other rural communities. And unless those kids, or the parents of those kids, are willing to put them on a bus to travel a long distance, their opportunities may be not the same as somebody living here in Cambridge. So this isn't going to be a 100% perfect solution. But I'd like to see us, it seems to me that the challenge of encouraging diversity is one that we can embrace once we agree that diversity is a goal.
I haven't given much thought to the role of parents in this process, because when I talk to teachers privately, they will say that one element that's operating in the school systems at the local level is that there's fear, in the sense that many administrators are afraid of talking straight and educationally to parents. They're kind of using a political lens, or it's a political conversation. So, for example, somebody might go into the school system in Lexington and say, look, if you don't provide this for my child, we're just going to sue you. And the people sitting around the table will say, well, we can meet this, what we'll do is we'll avoid the lawsuit, okay? Then you have teachers saying that they're not being supported by administrators when parents complain. Then you have the problem of the lack of engagement of many parents in low-income communities. But in a community like Lexington, or a suburban community, many of these parents have a notion of social entitlement. They've subcontracted this job and I'm paying you and you owe me. So what are your thoughts about how there can be a really productive conversation or dialogue, or the role of parents in this process?
Well, you're pointing to a continuum of experiences, starting with the parents who are completely disengaged, not because they hate their kids, but because either they are so busy and exhausted from their jobs, or because they don't know that they have some power and don't know how to exercise the power they have. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is the parent who knows how to run a school system better than the superintendent and the principal and the teachers and everybody else. I don't know that we're going to change human nature. So I suspect that problem will continue to exist in one dimension or another, no matter what we do. But I'd like to think that if we think about a school system as serving all the members of the community, not just our little darlings between age 5 and 18, but that it's serving us, then there's some ownership. And certainly if there needs to be an ongoing review of what the school is doing and how well it's doing and what it's proposing to do, there has to be some communication within a community and within a school community in particular to make this model operative. So I'd like to think that with that ownership is going to come a different dynamic between the people in the relationship. That may be wishful thinking, but I think it's at least partially true.
Hi. I just wanted to address the question of basically, it's hard enough as an educator to think about, okay, we now have some locus of local control and we can make decisions, but, kind of piggybacking the point that you made that we teach like we've always taught, and I'm just wondering if you have thought about concessions for how you empower educators to actually make that step to take on local control, because our model is the model that we've experienced for 24 years of education, which is very teacher-directed, very teacher-centered learning, and So that's my first question, like how to implement and empower educators to really take that creative step. And I think you can offer financial incentives, but even really well-meaning intentioned teachers may just not know what to do. So that's the first question. The second question is just addressing the matter of top-down. And I really like kind of the accreditation process, but I think that's something that's really important that's missing in that process. That still, to me, seems very top-down because I work from the perspective of really encouraging and fostering self-directed learning in my students and really encouraging them to be the driving force in their own education. There's lots of information out there and lots of directions to take your learning. How do we help them to focus and support them in identifying things that they really want to learn? And I think that they're a really important voice in that process. So I just was eager to hear what your thoughts are on that as well. Thank you.
Great. A couple of good questions. Let me sort of speak to the second one first. Although having an accreditation agency still means there's some authority in the process, I'd be perfectly willing to let go of that notion if I could come up with something better. And so far, at least, I haven't. Because I think you do need, to the extent that what we're talking about here is an institution that's going to be publicly funded and serve a public purpose, there has to be some representation of the public in making sure that the system is up and running and operating well and serving the public. And I don't know that you can simply leave it to chance you may do a brilliant job with your kids, but how do I know that your colleague is doing a brilliant job with her kids? There's got to be some mechanism in here for assuring that the public purpose is being served and that the public funds are being well spent. And again, I don't know that the accreditation model is the best, certainly not the only model, but I think it points to a different kind of model than the one we now have. And what I particularly like about it speaks to your first question. It invites teachers like you to get together with a bunch of other teachers and maybe some parents who like what you've been doing and get a license to keep doing it and get public funding to keep doing it and get the blessings of the community, the larger educational community, to do it. And you spoke to the challenges that you face, and I think that in order for this to work, you would need to be given not only the encouragement to do that and the invitation to do that, but a lot of resources to do it. And that's probably going to include time to just step back a little bit and think, maybe some professional development opportunities, some coaching in how to think about inventing a school or reinventing yourself as a teacher. I don't think this is, again, we've come to think of the teaching profession as a very isolated kind of enterprise. That won't work. You can't. I'm asking you to do more as a teacher and be a real professional in the system, not just a professional in your classroom. And that won't happen without what every profession needs. You need to be compensated as a professional. You need to be supported, challenged as a professional. And you need to be part of an empowered professional community. You can't get there from here in the way we think about teachers right now.